"Open that door now, Andrew." Frank's voice echoed through the hallway of my Boston apartment, accompanied by violent punches that shook the door on its hinges. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and my stepfather was clearly drunk. Through the peephole, I saw my mother, Diane, standing behind him, her face pale with terror. His eyes pleaded silently, but not for my safety, for forgiveness in advance for what was about to happen. "Frank, please, let's go," she whispered, but he ignored her completely. Crack. The lock gave way with the third kick, and Frank burst into my living room like a hurricane of rage and alcohol. Before I could react, his fists found my face with enough force to send me reeling against the wall. "You think you can destroy my family?" he roared, grabbing my shirt and throwing me against the coffee table. The glass shattered under my weight, cutting my forehead. "Trying to convince her to leave me with your constant phone calls." "My name is Andrew, I'm 30 years old, and I'm a trauma therapist here in Boston. Ironically, I spend my days helping victims of domestic violence rebuild their lives. But in the early hours of that morning, I was just another victim being beaten by a man who had terrorized my family for nearly 2 decades. Frank twisted his right arm so hard I felt my collarbone snap. The pain was instant and nauseating, radiating through my chest like liquid fire. I screamed, but the sound was muffled as he pressed my face into the broken glass on the floor. "Frank, stop. You're hurting him." My mother finally found her voice, but she remained frozen in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth in horror. "He deserves this." Frank spat, lifting my body only to throw me back against the wall. My vision darkened for a moment, but I could see my mother through my tears. She was crying, but she didn't move an inch to help me. With my left hand, I managed to reach my cell phone, which had fallen near the couch. 3 quick presses of the emergency button sent my location to the emergency services, but Frank kicked him in the ribs before he could do anything. The last sound he heard before losing consciousness was the sound of sirens approaching, while his mother stood still, watching his body collapse on the floor covered in blood and glass. But what Frank didn't know, what none of us could have imagined, was that this night of terror was only the first move in a much more complex game. A game I had begun planning years earlier, when I realized that the only way to save my mother was to completely destroy the man who controlled her. If you're following this story of survival and don't want to miss any details of how I turned the worst night of his life into the beginning of Frank's downfall, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because as I was being taken to the hospital in that ambulance, I already knew exactly how Frank would pay for every second of pain he had caused our family. I woke up in the hospital with the smell of disinfectant burning my nostrils and the throbbing pain in my collarbone brutally reminding me of every second of that early morning. Eric, my boyfriend of 3 years, was sitting next to the stretcher, his eyes red from not sleeping. "He's in jail," were his first words, her voice laden with a restrained anger I had rarely seen before. "Assault and battery, breaking and entering." The judge denied bail. But I knew Frank Sullivan wouldn't stay behind bars for long. He had money, connections, and an impeccable reputation carefully built over 20 years as a respected bank executive in Boston. More importantly, he had her completely under his control. Frank had come into our lives when I was only 8, shortly after my father died of lung cancer. My mother, Diane, was devastated financially and emotionally, trying to keep our small house in the suburbs while working 2 jobs to pay the medical bills that insurance didn't cover. He appeared as a savior. The manager of the bank where my mother had gotten a job as a teller, Frank was everything my father had not been in the last years of his life: financially stable, sober, present. At 12, when they got married, I truly believed that our life had finally found peace. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Frank started out helping my mother with the finances, convincing her to close her personal account and consolidate everything into a joint account that he managed. "It's more efficient," he would say, kissing her forehead with calculated tenderness. "This way I can take care of you properly." Then came the opinions about his friends. Susan talked too much about his marital problems, creating negative energy in the house. Karen was a gossip and couldn't be trusted with intimate family matters. Jennifer spent too much money and could influence my mother to develop irresponsible habits. One by one, my mother's friends disappeared from our lives. Phone calls became rare, coffee dates ceased altogether. Frank always had a logical explanation, always involving words like protection and family first. I was a teenager when the first signs of physical violence appeared. A bruise on my mother's wrist that she said came from a fall. A cut on her lip explained away as an accident with a cabinet door. When I questioned her, she became defensive, angry with me for creating problems where there weren't any. "Frank takes care of us," she repeated like a mantra. "He's given us a good life, Andrew. You should be grateful." But I saw what she refused to admit. The vibrant woman who used to sing while she cooked had become a silent shadow, checking with Frank before making any purchase, even a magazine at the grocery store. Her cheerful personality was replaced by constant caution, as if she were always calculating whether her actions would provoke his disapproval. Frank was a master of psychological control. He never yelled, rarely lost his composure in public. Her favorite weapon was the icy silence that could last for days, turning our home into an emotional graveyard until my mother begged forgiveness for some imagined transgression. When I turned 16, I got a part-time job at a local bookstore and began saving every penny for college. Frank seemed proud of my independence, especially when he told the neighbors about my exemplary character and admirable work ethic. It was a perfect performance by the proud stepfather. In truth, he was relieved to have me out of the house. My presence was a constant reminder that my mother had existed before him, that she had loved another man deeply and willingly. I represented a period of her life that he couldn't control or rewrite. During my college years studying psychology, I obsessively studied patterns of domestic abuse. Every class on psychological manipulation felt like a clinical analysis of her own family. I learned about social isolation, financial control, gaslighting, and the tension explosion honeymoon cycle that defined abusive relationships. More importantly, I learned that victims of domestic abuse take an average of 7 attempts before they are able to leave his abusers permanently. And I discovered that the most dangerous time for a victim is precisely when she tries to leave. That's why 2 years ago, when my mother called me in tears saying she had found materials about women's shelters that someone had sent in the mail, I knew she was in mortal danger. Frank had found the pamphlets I sent and went into a silent rage that lasted 3 weeks. "He said you're trying to destroy our family," she whispered on the phone, clearly with Frank nearby. "He said if I try to leave, he'll find you wherever you are." That night, I started documenting everything. Every phone call, every text message, every strange visit my mother made to my apartment, always when Frank was away on business. I photographed the bruises she tried to hide with makeup. I recorded conversations where she admitted, in moments of weakness, that she was afraid of him. I knew that one day Frank would come after me. Men like him don't tolerate challenges to her authority, especially from someone she sees as inferior. The only surprise was that it took him so long. But while Frank thought he had silenced me with that brutal display of power, he had made the one mistake I had been waiting for years. He had physically attacked me, leaving indisputable evidence of his true nature. What he didn't know was that I had spent 2 years building a complete case against him. And now, with my broken collarbone serving as the final piece of evidence, I finally had everything I needed to destroy the man who had stolen my mother from me. The nurse came in to check my vitals, interrupting her thoughts. But as she adjusted the 4, I was already mentally reviewing the next steps of the plan I would begin executing as soon as I was discharged. Frank thought that night had been about teaching me a lesson. In reality, it had been just the first move in a game I had been planning for much longer than he could have imagined. 3 days after being discharged from the hospital, I was at home trying to find a comfortable position on the couch when Eric arrived with news that made my blood run cold. "Frank was released today," he said, her voice tense. "His lawyer got his bail reduced. He argued that he wasn't a flight risk because he's a respected member of the community." My collarbone still throbbed with constant pain, and the bruises on his face had turned grotesque shades of purple and yellow. Every movement was a painful reminder of that early morning, but the news of Frank's release stirred something much more intense than physical pain. "How long until the trial?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. 6 to 8 months at least," Eric replied, sitting down carefully beside me. "The system is overloaded, and his lawyer is going to try every possible delay." That night, my mother called for the first time since the attack. Her voice was different, weaker, as if the trauma had drained her of her last reserves of energy. "Andrew, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have done something. I should have protected you." "Where are you now, Mom?" I asked, ignoring her apologies for the moment. "With my sister Linda, in Providence. Frank doesn't know I'm here." There was a long pause. "He's been trying to call me, sending messages. He says it was a misunderstanding, that he was drunk and didn't know what he was doing." And you believe her? Another silence. I don't know what to believe anymore, Andrew. 20 years of my life with this man, and now I find out I didn't really know her. Over the next few weeks, my life became a carefully controlled routine. Physical therapy 3 times a week to regain movement in my collarbone. Sessions with a trauma psychologist to deal with the emotional aftermath of the attack. And secretly, meetings with Jessica Martinez, the criminal defense attorney Eric had found to represent me. Jessica was a woman in her 40s with dark hair always pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see through any lie. During our first official consultation, she examined the photographs of my injuries with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen a lot of domestic violence. We have a solid case, she said, closing the folder. Home invasion, assault with battery, threats. With her previous documentation of abuse against your mother, we can establish a pattern of violent behavior. How long could he get? I asked. If he's convicted on all counts, anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But Andrew, she paused, studying my expression. Men like Frank Sullivan rarely go to prison on their first trial. He has resources, connections, a reputation built over decades. Prepare yourself for a long fight. It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. I looked at Jessica and said with absolute calm, I want to completely destroy his life. Not just send him to prison. I want him to lose everything. Jessica raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. What do you have in mind? Over the next few weeks, I began executing the first phase of my plan. I contacted Catherine, my former supervisor at the mental health center, who now ran an organization that supported victims of domestic violence. I explained that I wanted to document his case publicly to help other men who suffered domestic abuse. Domestic violence against men is drastically underreported, I explained during our meeting. My story could encourage others to come forward. Catherine agreed immediately. You're right. And with your background in clinical psychology, his voice would have special credibility. What Catherine didn't know was that my intention went far beyond helping other victims. During my years studying Frank, I had uncovered secrets about his life that could destroy not only his freedom but his entire social identity. Frank Sullivan, the respected banking executive, had a history that few knew about. Through meticulous research in public records and careful conversations with former bank employees, I discovered that he had manipulated 3 promotions throughout his career, deliberately undermining colleagues to advance her own position. More importantly, I discovered that Frank had hidden a son from a previous relationship, a son he abandoned when he was only 2 years old. The boy, now a 28-year-old man named Marcus, had grown up in a foster family after his biological mother died in a car accident. 2 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital, I managed to track Marcus down through social media. He was living in Chicago, working as a software engineer, and had no idea that his biological father was a successful executive in Boston who could have completely changed his life. Our first phone conversation was devastating for both of us. My real name is Marcus Sullivan, he told me, his voice heavy with years of repressed pain. I've spent my entire life wondering why my father abandoned me. I even hired a private investigator a few years ago, but he said Frank Sullivan had disappeared without a trace. He moved to a different city and created a new identity, I explained. He married my mother and pretended to be a completely different man. Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was a determination in his voice that I recognized immediately. What do you plan to do with this information? It depends, I replied carefully. Do you want to meet the man who abandoned you? The following week, I started receiving strange calls on my landline. Always late at night, always silent on the other end of the line. Eric suggested we change our number, but I knew exactly who was calling. Frank was testing to see if I had changed my routine, checking to see if I was home, gathering information. The classic behavior of a predator planning his next move. During one of these silent calls, I decided to speak up. I know it's him, Frank, I said calmly into the phone. And I want him to know that I'm counting the days until our trial. The line went silent for a few seconds before hanging up abruptly. 2 days later, Eric found the tires of his car slashed in the parking lot at his work. There were no security cameras in that specific area, no evidence linking the incident to Frank, but we both knew it wasn't a coincidence. He's escalating, Eric said, examining the precise cuts in the tires. Trying to intimidate us before the trial. But Frank had made a crucial mistake. Every act of intimidation only strengthened my legal case and justified the extreme measures I was planning to take against him. That night, while Eric slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printed documents. Photographs of my injuries, medical records, transcripts of recorded phone calls with my mother over the years, Marcus's contact information, and a digital file I had compiled on all of Frank's professional misconduct. But my most powerful weapon was in a separate folder, marked only with the initials PM Project Media. Professor Levine, my former mentor at the university, had put me in touch with an investigative journalist at a major Boston newspaper. Someone who specialized in exposing cases of domestic abuse and corporate corruption. Someone who was very interested in the story of a respected bank executive who violently attacked his stepson in the early hours of an October morning. I glanced at the calendar on the kitchen wall. There were 4 months left before the trial. 4 months to implement each phase of my plan. Frank thought he had silenced me with that brutal display of power. In fact, he had just given me the final moral justification she needed to systematically destroy everything he had built on lies and intimidation. As I closed my laptop, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The physical pain was gradually subsiding, but his mind had never been so clear. Frank Sullivan had spent 20 years building a facade of respectability, accumulating power through fear and control. Now he would discover that he had chosen the wrong victim. Because while he slept in his comfortable bed, planning his next attempt at intimidation, I was meticulously organizing every element of her complete ruin. And unlike him, I would not make the mistake of underestimating my opponent. 2 weeks after the flat tire incident, Marcus arrived in Boston on a rainy Friday in November. We met at an inconspicuous cafe in Cambridge, far from the prying eyes of Frank's social circle. Marcus was clearly Frank's son, the same strong jaw, the same piercing blue eyes, but where Frank cultivated an intimidating presence, Marcus exuded a determined calm that reminded me of myself. "I brought everything I could gather," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Original birth certificate, correspondence from my adoptive mother, even some old photos of him with my biological mother. I examined the documents carefully. The certificate clearly listed Frank Sullivan as the father, dated 1995, 2 years before he met my mother. The photographs showed a young, seemingly happy Frank holding a blonde child who was obviously her. "He disappeared a week after my mother died in the accident," Marcus continued, her voice controlled but laden with decades of repressed pain. "He never tried to contact us. He never sent any money. He just vanished." "And you want to confront him publicly?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I want everyone to know what kind of man he really is. Someone who abandons a 2-year-old boy after his mother's death, then builds a new life pretending to be an exemplary family man." That afternoon, I introduced Marcus to Jessica Martinez, who was visibly excited by the legal possibilities his testimony opened up. "This completely changes the narrative," she explained, organizing documents on his office desk. "Frank isn't just a domestic abuser. He's a man with a history of family abandonment, deliberate lies about his past, and a pattern of building relationships based on deception." Over the next week, I implemented the second phase of my plan. I contacted David Morrison, the investigative journalist Professor Levine had mentioned. David worked for the Boston Herald and had a solid reputation for exposing cases of corporate corruption and abuse of power. Our first meeting was at a busy restaurant in downtown Boston. David was a man in his 50s with gray hair and eyes that seemed to be constantly evaluating every word he heard. "Her story has potential," he said after hearing her full account. "A respected bank executive who hides a past of family abandonment and violently abuses his stepson. But I need more than her word. I need evidence that can't be disputed." That's when I opened my second folder, the one she had kept as her secret weapon. "During my college years, I systematically documented all incidents of abuse against my mother," I explained, showing him dated photographs of bruises, audio recordings of phone conversations where she admitted to being afraid, and emails she had sent me describing suspicious accidents. David examined everything meticulously, taking notes and occasionally whistling softly in surprise. "This is professional-level documentation," he said finally. "You've been planning this for years." "I knew I would need to prove the truth one day," I replied. "Men like Frank are careful. They know how to hide her actions. But they are also arrogant. They underestimate her victims." David agreed to investigate the story, starting with independent research into Frank's professional background and attempts to locate other possible victims. Meanwhile, Frank was becoming increasingly bold in his attempts to intimidate me. Eric began receiving anonymous calls at work, always from someone claiming to be a concerned friend warning about my unstable behavior and violent tendencies. My mother called one night, visibly shaken. "He showed up at Linda's house today," she whispered. "He didn't say anything threatening, just stood across the street for an hour, staring at the house. Linda called the police, but by the time they got there, he was gone." "Mom, you need to document all of this," I instructed. "Every appearance, every phone call, every attempt at contact. We're building a case of stalking and witness intimidation." "Andrew, I'm afraid of what he might do," she admitted. Frank never took no for an answer. And now that he's losing control. "That's exactly why he needs to be stopped permanently," I replied firmly. The following week, I received an unexpected call from Catherine, my former supervisor at the mental health center. "Andrew, you need to know that Frank was here," she said, her voice tense. "He introduced himself as your concerned stepfather, claiming that you were having a psychological breakdown after the incident at your home." "What exactly did he want?" "Information about his professional background, psychological evaluations, anything he could use to question her credibility. Obviously, we didn't disclose anything due to privacy laws, but he was very insistent. He said he was trying to get a court order for involuntary hospitalization." The blood drained from my veins. Frank was trying to discredit me preemptively, creating a narrative where I was mentally unstable and couldn't be considered a reliable witness. That night, I called Jessica urgently. "He's trying to destroy my credibility before the trial even begins," I explained. "If he can plant doubts about her mental health, he can argue that she fabricated all the documentation against him." "That actually works in our favor," Jessica replied, surprising me. "It shows awareness of guilt and a pattern of psychological manipulation. We're going to file for a restraining order immediately, prohibiting any direct or indirect contact between Frank and you, her mother, or anyone associated with the case." But Frank had one last trump card I hadn't anticipated. The following Monday, Eric came home visibly upset. "My boss called me in for a meeting today," he said, loosening his tie with trembling hands. "Apparently, someone sent an anonymous email to our organization's entire board of directors, claiming that I'm romantically involved with an unstable client who has violent tendencies toward father figures." Did they believe it? My supervisor didn't, thankfully. He's known my work for years. But the board is concerned about the organization's reputation. They've put me on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Frank had found a way to attack Eric professionally, knowing that losing his job would create additional financial and emotional pressure in our lives. But while Frank thought he was isolating and weakening me, he was actually providing additional evidence of his pattern of manipulative and vindictive behavior. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with 3 different phones and a list of contacts I had compiled over months. It was time to implement the final phase of my plan, a phase that Frank could never anticipate or prepare for. I started with a call to Marcus in Chicago. "Are you ready to come to Boston permanently?" I asked. "I quit his job today," he replied. "And Andrew?" "I found something else." My adoptive mother kept all the letters that her biological mother wrote to Frank before she died. Letters begging him not to abandon his son. The second call was to David Morrison. "The article will be ready for publication next week," he confirmed. I was able to confirm 3 cases of professional misconduct at the bank where Frank works. Former colleagues who were willing to speak off the record about questionable practices. The third call was to a number I had saved last, the personal cell phone of the CEO of the bank where Frank worked. "Mr. Williams? My name is Andrew. I'm Frank Sullivan's stepson, and I believe there are some things about his employee that you should know before they become public. If you've been following this journey of how I turn trauma into strategy, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because the next revelations about Frank Sullivan will completely change the course of this story." While Frank slept that night, probably planning his next attempt to intimidate me, I was finalizing the details of a sequence of events that would not only land him in prison, but systematically destroy every pillar upon which he had built her life of lies. Frank Sullivan had spent 20 years believing that power meant controlling others through fear and manipulation. He was about to discover that true power comes from turning pain into purpose, isolation into alliance, and trauma into an unrelenting determination for justice. The man who attacked me that October morning had awakened something that had lain dormant for years, not just my anger, but his ability to orchestrate a response so meticulous and comprehensive that when it was over, Frank Sullivan would be remembered not as a respected executive, but as a case study on the inevitable consequences of systematic cruelty. The next morning, I would begin to implement a plan that would prove a fundamental truth: underestimating her victim is always the first step in becoming one. David Morrison's article was published on a Thursday morning at exactly 6 o'clock, just as Boston executives were checking their emails with their first cup of coffee. The headline was devastating: Bank executive abandons his son and assault stepson, the double life of Frank Sullivan. But that was only the first move. While Frank was probably discovering that his private life was being exposed to the entire city, I was in a meeting with Mrs. Williams, president of First National Bank, presenting documents that did not appear in the newspaper article. These are the records of irregular transfers that Frank authorized over the past 5 years, I explained, organizing the pages on the polished mahogany table. Each one technically within legal limits, but following a pattern that suggests systematic favoritism towards certain accounts. Williams examined the documents with growing alarm. Frank had used her position to benefit companies in which she had hidden financial interests, a conflict of interest that directly violated the bank's policies. How did you gain access to this information? Williams asked, her voice tense. Frank gave me access years ago, when I was considering a career in banking, I lied softly. He wanted to show me how real business worked. He never revoked her access. In fact, I had obtained the records through Margaret, a senior analyst whom Frank had publicly humiliated at a board meeting 2 years earlier. Margaret had harbored a silent grudge ever since, waiting for the right opportunity to get even. At 10 in the morning, Frank's phone began ringing incessantly. First it was Williams, summoning him to an urgent disciplinary meeting. Then it was her secretary, informing him that journalists were waiting in the bank lobby. Next, his wife from his first marriage, Marcus's mother, called from Chicago. But the call that really took him by surprise was mine. "Hello, Frank," I said calmly when he answered in a hoarse voice. "Andrew, his son of A," he started to explode, but I interrupted her. "Have you seen the news today? Interesting how certain stories come to light, isn't it?" There was a deadly silence on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice was different, controlled, dangerous. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," he said coldly. "I'm going to destroy you in court. I'll prove you're an unstable liar who made this whole thing up. Actually, Frank, you should check your emails. I just sent you something that might interest you." I heard his typing furiously, then a long, icy silence. The email contained photographs of Marcus, photographs dated from the period when Frank claimed he had no children. Photographs of his holding a blonde 2-year-old boy on a beach in Cape Cod. Photographs that Marcus had kept for 26 years, waiting for the day when he would confront the father who abandoned him. "Where did you get this?" Frank whispered. "His son is here in Boston, Frank. Marcus Sullivan. He would very much like to talk to you. In fact, he's outside your bank right now, talking to reporters." Through the window of Williams's office on the 12th floor, I could see the crowd of reporters gathering at the entrance to the building. Marcus was in the center, holding a folder with documents and photographs, telling her story to any microphone that came her way. Frank hung up abruptly. 15 minutes later, I got a call from Jessica Martinez. "Andrew, you need to know that Frank just tried to get a restraining order claiming that you're threatening and stalking him. He's using our phone calls as evidence of stalking." I smiled, opening my own folder of documents. "Jessica, Frank just made the stupidest mistake of his life." "What do you mean?" "He filed a formal complaint alleging that my calls constitute threats. That means I can now legally present recordings of every call he's made to me, my mother, Eric, Catherine, and anyone else in the last few months. Calls where he makes explicit threats, attempts intimidation, and even confesses details of the attack." At 2 in the afternoon, Frank was escorted out of the bank by security guards. Williams had decided to suspend him immediately pending an internal investigation, a move that virtually guaranteed his demise in the banking industry. But the real twist was yet to come. At 4 o'clock, I got a call from my mother. "Andrew, Frank just arrived at Linda's house. He's completely distraught, screaming that you destroyed his life." Linda called the police, But he's not technically violating the restraining order because he's not trying to make direct contact with me. Mom, do you have the recorder I gave you? Yes, it's on. Great. Now I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. Over the next 20 minutes, I coached my mother to strategically provoke Frank, asking questions that would make her confess details of the abuse we didn't yet have on tape. Questions about the times he had physically threatened her, about how he planned the attack on me, about other people he had intimidated over the years. Frank, in his emotionally charged state, fell into the trap completely. "You think this is going to stop me?" he yelled, her voice clearly audible on the recording. "I've built a whole life destroying people who oppose me. That arrogant little girl has no idea who she's up against." When the police arrived to remove Frank from Linda's property, I was already sending the recording to Jessica, David Morrison, and as a backup, directly to the district attorney's office. But Frank had one last desperate card to play. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Eric called in a panic. "Andrew, Frank showed up at my work. He told his supervisor a crazy story about you being a manipulative sociopath who orchestrated all of this to destroy an innocent man. He said he has evidence that you forged documents and lied about the abuse." "What evidence?" "He brought photographs. Andrew, they're photographs of his with bruises that were clearly made with makeup. He's claiming that you staged the entire attack." My blood ran cold. Frank had learned about my documentation techniques and decided to use the same strategy against me, creating false evidence that could cast doubt on my entire narrative. But while Frank thought he had found his way out, he had actually walked straight into the final trap I had set months earlier. "Eric, what time exactly did Frank arrive there?" "Around 5:15. I checked my watch. 5:45 in the afternoon. I grabbed my phone and dialed the hospital where he had been treated after the attack. "Dr. Sarah Chun, please. This is Andrew Moore, regarding his domestic assault case." When the doctor answered, I quickly explained the situation. "Dr. Chun, Frank is claiming that he faked his injuries. Could you provide a detailed report of the X-rays that show exactly how his collarbone was dislocated?" "Of course, Andrew. In fact, I have medical photographs of the injuries that clearly show the specific pattern of injuries. There is no way to fake bone fractures and deep tissue damage." By 7 o'clock that evening, Jessica had delivered the complete medical report to Frank's lawyer, along with a threat of a lawsuit for defamation and falsification of evidence. At 8 o'clock that evening, Frank's lawyer called Jessica. My client would like to discuss a settlement. It was at that moment that Frank finally understood the devastating truth. There was no way out. Every move he made only deepened his situation. Every lie he told was immediately disproved by evidence I had prepared in advance. But while Frank was preparing to try to negotiate his surrender, I was setting in motion the final phase of the plan, a phase that would ensure he could never again threaten my family or anyone else. True justice would not be merely his imprisonment or public humiliation. It would be the complete transformation of the system that had allowed men like him to operate with impunity for decades. And while Frank prepared to beg for mercy, I was ensuring that the story that began with her broken collarbone would end with a permanent change that would protect countless future victims. The game was over, but Frank didn't yet know that he had lost much more than her freedom and reputation. He had lost any chance that her story would be forgotten or minimized. The next morning, when he woke up in a county jail cell, he would discover that his downfall had become a case study that would be used to train mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and attorneys for years to come. Frank Sullivan would not just be a convicted felon. He would be a permanent example of the inevitable consequences of underestimating her victims. Frank Sullivan was sentenced to 15 years in prison on multiple charges: aggravated assault and battery, breaking and entering, stalking, witness intimidation, and bank fraud. The trial lasted only 3 days, just long enough for all of Boston to see the true face of the man who had deceived an entire community for 2 decades. Marcus became a constant presence in my life, not only as a half-brother, but as a partner in the foundation we created, the Sullivan Recovery Foundation. It is ironic that the surname of the man who hurt us has become a symbol of healing for other families torn apart by domestic violence. My mother spent 2 years in intensive therapy, rebuilding her identity after decades of psychological control. Today she lives in her own apartment, works as a volunteer counselor at the center I founded, and wears his favorite red lipstick again. The vibrant woman I knew as a child has gradually returned, wiser and stronger than ever. Eric and he were married the year after the trial, in a small but deeply meaningful ceremony. He never saw me as a victim, even in the darkest moments, and her unwavering support taught me that shared vulnerability is not the same as weakness. David Morrison won an investigative journalism award for his series of reports on Frank Sullivan. Her investigation expanded to expose a network of executives who used their positions of power to silence victims of abuse. 3 other similar cases came to light after my story went public. The bank where Frank worked implemented new background check protocols and established a fund to support employees who are victims of domestic violence. Margaret, the analyst who helped his wife with the financial documents, was promoted to head of compliance. 2 years after her arrest, I received a handwritten letter from Frank. For pages of desperate apologies, claims of rehabilitation in prison, pathetic pleas for forgiveness. I read it once and destroyed it immediately. Some people deserve a second chance. Others are case studies in the inevitable consequences of systematically cruel choices. My collarbone never fully regained her range of motion. On cold mornings, I still feel pain that reminds me of that October dawn. But I've learned to see these physical scars not as evidence of what I lost, but as proof of what I survived. Today, I run the Breakthrough Recovery Center in Boston, a comprehensive center that provides legal advocacy, psychological support, and practical resources to victims of domestic violence. Our waiting list is 6 months long, but we never turn away emergency cases. The most profound part of my work happens when I see the exact moment when a victim realizes they are not alone, that they have options, that they deserve better. It's the same moment I experienced when I decided that Frank would pay for her actions, the transformation from helplessness to agency. Frank will be eligible for parole in 10 years. When that day comes, I will be present at the hearing to ensure that every detail of his crimes is remembered. Not out of revenge, but to honor all the victims who never had a chance to speak her truth. If this story of transforming trauma into purpose has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about how ordinary people find extraordinary strength when confronted with injustice. The last time I saw Frank was during her sentencing, when the judge read out 15 years. He looked directly at me, perhaps expecting satisfaction or triumph in my eyes. Instead, he saw only the quiet resolve of someone who had learned that true power doesn't come from controlling others through fear, but from turning pain into purpose, isolation into community, and survival into service. Frank Sullivan thought he had found an easy victim. In fact, he had awakened someone who would dedicate her life to ensuring that future victims would never remain silent or alone. Justice was not Frank going to prison. Justice was the life I built afterward.